All right, today we're going deep, really deep.
Buckle up.
Yeah, into a prediction, actually, from way back in 2006 about, well, the rise of a Mexican mega cartel. Pretty chilling stuff.
Definitely a topic that grabs your attention.
We're using a report called The Reality of a Mexican Mega Cartel by Sam Logan.
Okay, so we're looking back to understand maybe where we are now.
Exactly. What's fascinating is how that prediction from back then might actually, well, how it reflects on today, you know.
Makes sense. I mean, to grasp the whole mega cartel thing, you got to get the context right.
For sure.
Back in 2006, the scene down in Mexico, the drug landscape, it was volatile, to say the least.
Yeah, I bet.
Just to illustrate, by mid-September 2006, they'd already clocked over 1,000 deaths.
1,000.
Yeah, all tied to organized crime. That's more than the entire year before.
Wow. That's a lot.
It was. The government, well, they were trying, but
Yeah.
even their efforts to fight back against the cartels, they seem to be, I guess you could say, failing. There's this security analyst, Ricardo Ravello. He even called 2005 a lost year.
A lost year.
Yeah, in that fight. Highlighted how President Fox back then had this Operation Safe Mexico,
Right.
but it didn't have much success, to put it mildly.
So you've got this picture of escalating violence, things getting out of hand. What was the government saying at the time?
Well, it was all over the place, to be
Yeah.
honest. Some officials were like, nope, everything is fine, under control.
Really?
Yeah. But then you had others, like the National Commission on Human Rights.
Great.
They were painting a much bleaker picture.
I bet.
Talked about a society under threat, like seriously under threat.
That's a pretty big gap between those two viewpoints.
Oh, absolutely.
So with all this chaos, who are the big players? Was it just a complete free-for-all?
Not exactly. The report zeroes in on three main cartels.
Mhm.
The Sinaloa cartel, the Juarez cartel, and the Tijuana cartel.
Okay, right.
Each of them had their own things.
Strengths, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Strength.
Okay. Sinaloa, led by El Chapo. Right, right. Notorious guy. They were known for, well, ruthlessness and a vast network.
Right.
And he had Juarez, controlled by the Carrillo Fuentes family.
Correct.
They had deep connections, like really deep, within the Mexican government.
Oh, wow.
And then Tijuana, headed by the Arellano Felix family.
Right.
They were known for their smuggling operations, like really sophisticated stuff.
So basically a recipe for conflict, each one trying to be on top.
Pretty much.
Sure.
And the power, it was constantly shifting.
I can imagine.
For example, in 2005, a major player from the Juarez cartel got captured.
Okay.
Created a void, right?
Yeah.
A power vacuum. And El Chapo, with Sinaloa, they were ready to pounce.
Oh, I bet.
That could have been their ticket to becoming that mega cartel everyone was worried about.
So each cartel with their own advantages, let's call it.
Yeah.
What about Tijuana? They were big, right? But then they started declining.
Well, they leaned heavily on violence,
Oh, okay.
and it became their downfall, really?
Huh. Their leader, Benjamin Arellano Felix, he got arrested in 2002.
Right.
That was the beginning of the end for them. They even tried to team up with the Gulf Cartel,
Really?
yeah, to hold on to their territory, but it all fell apart, made things even more unstable.
Like a domino effect?
Kind of, yeah. One thing leads to another, and suddenly you're staring at the possibility of one cartel ruling everything.
Scary thought. What happened next in this whole power struggle?
So in 2006, Javier Arellano Felix, another big name in Tijuana, he gets captured too.
Okay.
And this raised a huge question. Would Tijuana finally crumble completely?
Right.
Or would someone new step in, fill the void?
Things were getting pretty tense, it sounds like.
They were. And remember, Javier, he was known for being extremely violent.
Right.
But his siblings, Enedina and Eduardo, they were in line to take over. They had a different reputation,
How so?
more business-oriented, more strategic, you know?
So a change in leadership style.
Yeah, potentially.
Did that make them less dangerous?
Yeah.
Or maybe even more so?
That's the thing, right? They were still dangerous. Remember that tunnel?
I don't know.
Yeah, the one they found under the U.S.-Mexico border. Super sophisticated.
Oh, right.
A lot of people thought that was Tijuana's doing, even under the siblings.
Mm.
It showed they were playing the long game, willing to invest in, well, complicated operations.
So we have a weakened Tijuana cartel, but with new leadership, maybe more strategic. We have El Chapo, seemingly unstoppable. And this question mark, more conflict, or this mega cartel becoming a reality.
Yeah. And that takes us to what the report calls the reality of a Mexican mega cartel.
Oh,
This idea that one group could control the entire border, that was terrifying. It would impacted everything. Drugs, weapons, people, all flowing through that border.
chilling. And this wasn't just Mexico's problem, right?
No way. The U.S. had a lot at stake.
I bet.
The report even pointed out that the U.S. was already, not relying so much on Mexico for border security. A mega cartel with all that power. It would have been a direct threat to U.S. national security.
So the stakes were huge, even beyond just drugs.
Absolutely. And we were talking about how the cartels were branching out.
Right, right.
The Gulf Cartel was recruiting those Caibiles.
The Caibiles, those were...
Former Guatemalan special forces. Brutal reputation.
Right, yeah, I remember. That's terrifying.
It showed just how far the cartels were willing to go. And there were even links between Sinaloa and the Maras.
The Maras, the Central American gangs.
Yep. All signs of a much wider network.
This is pretty intense. So, moving into the second part of this deep dive, the big question is, did it actually happen?
Did the mega cartel rise up?
Yeah. Did the prediction become reality?
That's what we'll be exploring next. What happened after 2006, how things evolved, whether the reality matched the forecast, so to speak. So, picking up where we left off, this whole idea of a mega cartel controlling the entire U.S.-Mexico border.
Right. A pretty daunting scenario.
It was, especially when you consider, well, this was post 9/11.
Oh, yeah, true.
The U.S. was already, super focused on border security and a mega cartel. That would have been, well, a huge vulnerability.
Yeah, I can see that.
Not just for drugs, but weapons, people, even anyone trying to slip across.
So a national security nightmare, basically.
Absolutely. And for Mexico.
Yeah.
Imagine what that would have done to their government.
Right, like they wouldn't even be able to control their own territory.
Some analysts even called it a powerless state.
Wow, that's pretty stark.
It was a real concern, though. You had all this corruption within law enforcement and the cartels. They had money, weapons, people, you name it.
So how could the government even fight back? It sounds almost impossible.
It was a huge challenge. And this was all happening, remember, as Calderon was coming into power.
Right, Calderon in 2006.
He was all about taking a hard line against the cartels.
So like military force.
Exactly. A full-on confrontation.
Was that seen as a good idea back then?
It was a mixed bag, really. Some people were all for it, thought it was the only way. But others, they were worried it would just lead to more violence.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they also argued, rightfully so, that it wouldn't fix the root problems, like poverty, corruption, the things that made the cartels so powerful in the first place.
Right, so even with a new president, a tough stance, it still wasn't clear if they could actually win this fight.
It was a really complex situation, and if this mega cartel had actually formed, well, it's hard to say exactly what would happen.
Yeah, paint a picture for me. What would it have looked like on the ground?
I think the violence would have exploded as they consolidated their power.
Like anyone who got in their way?
Exactly. Journalists, politicians, rival cartel members, all targets.
And we were talking about how the cartels were branching out, getting into other stuff besides drugs.
Oh, yeah, it wasn't just about smuggling anymore.
Right, the Gulf Cartel had those Caibiles.
Ruthless, those guys.
And Sinaloa was linked to the Maras.
It was about controlling territory, resources, whole communities even.
So it wouldn't just be like shootouts in the streets. It would affect everyday life.
For sure.
Yeah.
Imagine living in a place where these groups could do whatever they wanted.
Scary stuff. But this report, it's from 2006, right? We're in 2024 now. So did any of this actually happen? Did we get a mega cartel?
That's the big question. And honestly, it's tough to say for sure.
How come?
The drug world, it's secretive, complicated. Information's not always reliable.
So how do we even figure it out? What should we be looking for?
Well, let's start with violence. If you have one mega cartel, theoretically, they wipe out the competition.
Less infighting, less violence.
Exactly. So has that happened?
I mean, the border's still dangerous, right?
Yeah.
But has it gotten better since 2006?
Not really. There have been ups and downs, sure. But overall, violence is still high. We still see multiple groups fighting for control, which suggests no one's really achieved total dominance.
Okay, that's one clue. What else? With the drugs coming into the U.S., a mega cartel would control a huge chunk of that flow, right?
So has there been a big change in what drugs are being smuggled, or how much?
That's tricky because the drug trade is always changing, evolving.
Right, like fentanyl, that's become a big problem.
Yeah.
And the routes, the methods they use, those are constantly shifting too.
So it's hard to track who's really in charge.
Exactly. But so far, we haven't seen anything to suggest one cartel has a monopoly.
Okay, so based on that, the violence, the drugs, it doesn't seem like the mega cartel became a reality.
Not in the way the report predicted, anyway.
Anything else we can look at?
What about the Mexican government? Have they gotten a handle on things? Are they more effective at fighting organized crime now than in 2006?
I know Calderon got a lot of criticism for his approach.
Yeah, the violence really escalated under him.
What about after him?
Every administration since has faced the same challenges. They've made some progress, sure, but the cartels are still a huge force.
So it sounds like it's not as simple as one big bad guy controlling everything.
Right, it's much more complicated than that.
But doesn't mean it's any less dangerous, right?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, it might be even more complex and challenging now than it was back then.
So even though the mega cartel, as predicted, didn't happen, the problems the report highlighted are still there.
Yeah.
Maybe even worse.
And we have to factor in how the drug trade itself has changed.
Like you said, fentanyl, new drugs, new routes, new technology.
It's a constantly moving target.
So where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Here's something to think about. We've been focusing on these big, powerful organizations.
Right.
But we can't forget about the people caught in the middle.
The people who are actually affected by all of
It's
this.
exactly. Families, communities, individuals, hey, their stories are often overlooked.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the geopolitics, the strategies.
But the human cost is real.
And it's huge. You know, it's crazy, right? We talk about cartels, governments, the drug trade, all this big picture stuff.
It's easy to get lost in it.
Yeah. But we forget sometimes about the people, like
Right.
the real people caught in the middle of it all.
It's about more than just statistics and strategies.
It's about families, communities, individuals, real consequences for real people.
Absolutely.
Like their stories often don't make the news.
They're invisible, in a way.
Yeah, but they're the ones dealing with the fallout, the consequences of all this.
Think about the farmers, for example, down in Mexico in rural areas.
Yeah, what about them?
They might be forced into growing these drug crops.
Because they have no other choice.
Exactly. No other way to survive, really. Or the young people who see the cartel as, like, their only option.
A way out.
Yeah, a way out of poverty, maybe. But then they get trapped.
In the violence.
In the violence, the cycle of it all. It's tragic.
It really is. And what about the families of the victims? You know, the ones caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of pain.
The parents who've lost kids, the spouses left behind, the communities just living in fear.
The trauma is immense.
It is. And it's not just a Mexican problem, right?
No, not at all. This reaches way beyond Mexico. The U.S., Canada, Europe, wherever there's a demand for drugs.
It's global.
A global problem with very real, very local consequences.
Like here in the U.S., we see it with the opioid crisis.
Absolutely. The strain on the healthcare system.
The violence in some communities.
Not all connected.
It's a reminder that this isn't just some abstract thing we're talking about.
It's real people, real lives being affected every single day.
And we've been saying it, but it's often the most vulnerable who suffer the most.
The poor, the marginalized, the ones with the least resources.
The ones who can least afford it.
Exactly. And that's why we need to think about this problem, approach it from all angles.
Not just law enforcement.
Not just that. We need to look at the root causes.
The poverty, the inequality.
The lack of opportunity. If we want to make a real difference, that's where we need to start.
So, looking forward, what can we do? What solutions are we talking about?
Well, we have to invest in education, job creation, community development.
Especially in the places hit hardest by the drug trade.
Yeah, give people real alternatives, real hope for the future.
And what about here in the U.S.? I mean, we're part of this too, right?
Of course. We have to acknowledge our role in the demand for drugs.
So what does that look like?
We need to talk honestly about addiction, mental health,
The social factors that contribute to drug use.
and drug policy. Are we doing the right things? Are there alternatives to criminalization?
Harm reduction, treatment, prevention.
Those are all part of the conversation.
It's complicated, for sure. But one thing's clear. We can't forget about the human side of all this.
Absolutely.
The individuals affected, their pain, their stories.
Working towards a future where everyone has a chance to live with dignity, with security.
That's a tall order.
It is, but it's worth fighting for.
I think that's a good place to leave it. This whole world of Mexican drug cartels, it's complex, it's challenging.
It is.
But hopefully, we've shown not just the power struggles, the politics of it all, but also the human cost.
Mm-hmm.
The real lives caught in the middle. It's a story that's still unfolding, and it's one that deserves our attention.
Our empathy, too, and our commitment to finding a better way forward.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.